Takaichi Sanae's three-day visit to Washington, D.C. has begun with praises on both sides, including in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. Watch.
We've had tremendous support and relationship with Japan on everything, and I believe that based on statements that were given to us yesterday, the day before yesterday, having to do with Japan, they are really stepping up to the plate. Yes, unlike NATO.
でも私は、世界の、繁栄とそして、平和に、貢献できる、世界中に、平和と繁栄をもたらせるのはドナルドだけだと思っています。
But even against that backdrop, I firmly believe that it is only you, Donald, who can achieve peace across the world.
でそのために私は、諸外国に働きかけて、しっかりと応援をしたいと思っています。
And to do so, I am ready to reach out to many of the partners in the international community to achieve our objective together.
今日私はそれを伝えに来ました。
So today, I came here at the White House to directly convey this message to you.
In fact, hours before their summit, Japan, with the UK, France, Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, said they would assist the US in reopening Hormuz. They said, "We express our readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. We welcome the commitment of nations who are engaging in preparatory planning." But it's not clear what role that support would take, especially for Japan, which is constrained by its pacifist constitution, which would restrict the presence of Japan's self-defense force ships and even minesweeping vessels in Hormuz before the end of the war. And how blindsided was Takaichi on hearing the US president's bad analogy over Pearl Harbor? Trump was asked by a Japanese journalist why the US hadn't informed his allies in advance of the Iran strikes. Watch.
Well, one thing, you don't want to signal too much. You know, when we go in, we went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay, why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay.
And with the visit originally intended to focus on strengthening the US-Japanese alliance as China's aggressions mount, did Takaichi achieve her goal of refocusing Donald Trump's attention on the Indo-Pacific? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Ota Fumio, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces retired Vice Admiral. He's also Japan Institute for National Fundamentals Counselor, Planning Committee member and Senior Fellow. We're also joined online by Patrick Cronin, Hudson Institute Asia-Pacific Security Chair, former Center for a New American Security Asia-Pacific Security Program Senior Director. And in the studio, we're joined by Michael Chen, Democratic Progressive Party International Affairs Director. A very warm welcome, Michael, in the studio, and also to both of my online guests. So Takaichi Sanae told the Diet this week that the visit to Washington would be very difficult. So how well do you think the Japanese PM has handled the visit so far?
Well, even though the very strong pressure regarding President Trump's demand regarding sending JMSDF to the Strait of Hormuz, Prime Minister Takaichi always smiled and succeeded to promote an alliance in a higher level. She stressed the increasing oil production in the United States, namely Alaska. So I think this visit is very successful.
And Patrick, how well do you think Takaichi handled the comparison between Iran and Pearl Harbor?
Well, I think there was a bit of sucking of the teeth there, but I thought saying nothing essentially was the right thing. You just have to ignore with the president when he makes these sort of indecorous statements. He's famous for them. He's blunt. He meant it obviously as a jest, as bad a taste as it was. But you know, Japan is a big power, and that's history. And we're in a different era right now, and I think the Prime Minister is helping to steer Japan toward a much more normal, strong, confident position in the world.
So bringing Admiral Ota back in and moving back to the Strait of Hormuz, how difficult is it for Japan's PM, to support either, sending mine, sweepers or even maritime self-defense forces to that strait, to do this legally and in terms of public consensus?
Yes, under the current Japanese legal framework, it is impossible to send maritime self-defense force in the combat zone. After the ceasefire, Japan would be able to send minesweeping ships.
Okay, so you say only at the conclusion of the war. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And yet, Michael, you know, we do know that 90% of Japan's oil does come through the strait, and it's similar high dependence, well, not so high, but for Taiwan, maybe between, is it 50 to 70%?
Yeah, more than 70,
right,
according to some figures.
Yeah, so how keen should countries like Japan and also our own country, Taiwan, be to reopen the strait? I mean, in terms of Trump's argument, what he's saying is very clear. The US doesn't need the Strait of Hormuz for its oil, but the rest of the world does depend on it a lot, and especially Asia. So this should be a case of self-interest.
Well, it is a vital interest for Taiwan, right? As you mentioned, you know, 70% or 78% of the oil that we get comes from the Gulf and has to go through the Gulf of Hormuz. So it's going to be heavily impacted for sure. You know, one difference is that, you know, U.S. has made a more explicit ask to countries like Japan, to Europe, about really stepping in and helping with the effort. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, that ask hasn't been formally or officially explicitly made to Taiwan.
Let me just bring Admiral back in, and then we'll go back to Michael. Admiral, one of the reasons that the US is very keen to ask for Japan's support is because of Japan's, you know, very well-known mine sweeping, but not just mine sweeping, also, you know, mine hunting and neutralization in terms of its prowess globally. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yes, we have a lot of experience since the end of World War II. Mogami class, we have 8 ships. They have a strong mine hunting capability. So that is our capability to mine sweep.
I do also have to mention to you, though, that China rather opportunistically has offered Taiwan energy security. Right. So it's taking, you know, the opportunity of this war in exchange for Taiwan's sovereignty. Is that a fair deal?
Of course not. I mean, that's a ridiculous statement from China, but really typical.
But Michael, is China's energy security that strong?
Look, it's not. Exactly. I mean, they're bluffing, and they're using this kind of cheap rhetorical trick to try to take advantage of us, right? Look, their reserves are somewhere between like 90 days and half a year. And ours is about, according to our deputy economic minister the other day in Parliament, about 150 days. So we are on par, and really they should be worried about their own energy supply. You know,
which comes also from the Gulf.
And look, from the Gulf, and also from Iran and Venezuela. And those two countries are not doing that well right now, are they? So look, they should be worried about their own supply, and they know it, but it doesn't stop them from using these rhetorical tools to try to be come off as generous, you know, and that's just one of their tactics that we've seen it time and time again. You know, they've said it with kind of the COVID testing kits, with the vaccines, you know, and again, like, the problem comes from a bigger issue is our energy security in terms of potential blockade situations. We're worried about, you know, in the event of these attacks, of blockade, right? How are we going to maintain a strong energy supply? And the biggest source of this problem is China. So China could really help resolve all of our energy security issues by, you know, backing off its threats against us.
Right.
So it's deeply ironic. And that they're putting out these, you know, so-called offers.
Absolutely. Bringing Patrick back from DC. So there's another level of self-interest there, isn't there, Patrick, that plays into this mix that Takaichi's having to deal with, and that's US and allied help during any Taiwan war or Asian war with China. Do you sense that this perhaps is also playing into why Trump isn't fully satisfied even with Japan's response, although he's not prepared to voice that publicly?
Well, it's hard to know what satisfies the president sometimes, but clearly there is a war going on. The main firing of missiles at Iran presumably is going to slow down or stop, and we will essentially have this period of relative peace. But I don't think the terrorism or the rocket fire toward the Strait will stop. Just as we saw the Houthi rebels firing into the Red Sea, they didn't have major combat forces to do that, and so they can wreak havoc on unarmed tankers, which is why it's important for allied countries eventually to provide some type of support for escorting these tankers, as we did during the Iran-Iraq War, and we did it successfully. There are two straits here, right? I mean, it's the Strait of Hormuz where we face the threat of Iranian attack or Iranian proxy attack on tankers, but it's also the Strait of Malacca that all this oil still must go through. China is very conscious of the fact that they are just as dependent on oil in the SLOCs, the sea lines of communication, in these choke points. So the more that Japan, Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, the United States, and other allies and partners can demonstrate ability to maintain sea control of choke points, that sends a strong signal to China that they have to worry about in a future conflict should they choose aggression.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with China watching this very carefully, I mean, what message does that send in terms of the allies being reluctant to step in? Or is this a completely different situation to a Taiwan?
Well, it's not completely different. Everything is related, but it is a different context that the president's asking allies and partners to step in. He didn't build the coalition ahead of time, and this was a war of choice. So those are mitigating factors that make it difficult for allies to immediately step in. Obviously, Japan has additional legal constraints. That's why they need the cessation of hostilities. That was what Admiral Ota was trying to refer to, that you need to stop the basic shooting, at least from the U.S. and Israeli side, before Japan can legally be part of that. But I think China will still take message of the fact that these capabilities are being built up. And at this summit, there's no shortage of, on the missile and munition side, what Japan and the United States are going to redouble their efforts on, because those missiles are going to be critical for air defenses, anti-ship attack, and other types of deterrent effects that China's watching very closely. So China is definitely pushing back on looking like aggression in the short term. And indeed, that's what the intelligence community reported this week. Despite the fact they also overstepped their sort of remit in terms of trying to interpret what Japan meant about Taiwan, they were right about China not looking for this as an opportunity right now, but build up their defense, build up their economy, and kind of bide their time a bit more while they try to encroach on Taiwan space, encroach on Japan, and exert more influence in the region.
Michael, you're the lead, or one of the leads for liaising between the ruling party here and also the ruling party in Japan. What's your feeling about the kind of support? In the end, we spoke a little bit about the constraints of Japan. You know, how does Takaichi balance this? So
they're facing that big hurdle that Prime Minister Takaichi has already highlighted, and I'm sure, before the meeting, I'm sure, with President Trump, right? So they do face this constitutional restraint and a constitution, of course, that the U.S. helped establish, right? And so, when you're talking about minesweeping, for example, right? They're allowed to do it, but only when it's not during the conflict. Right, they can do it before and after. And so that's sort of the constraint that Japan is facing.
Right. So you don't believe that they could send any ships currently?
I mean, I think they're capable of, but I don't think that they necessarily will. I think it's hard to assess.
So do you expect that Japan will not send any ships? And if that is the case, how does that impact Takaichi's relationship with Donald Trump?
Well, she delivered what she needed to today, a vague statement of support, a willingness to support, which was more than President Trump was hearing from some European allies, and that was his point, that this is different from NATO. So she said the right thing at the right time. We'll have to see what Japan can contribute in the future weeks and months. Japan will take part in a multinational peacekeeping operation, if you will, to help escort tankers if it's necessary because their national security depends on it. And legally, they'll be able to do so even if there are rebels and proxy forces still firing occasionally at the civilian commercial fleet that's flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. But she didn't have to do that today. So this is something she can now take back to Tokyo and study and see how can Japan contribute.
Okay. So next question. Japan has rejected a recent report by the US intelligence community, which characterized the Prime Minister's comments on Taiwan in November as, quote, a significant shift. The report appears to take the same stance as China's own. Watch.
日本首相高市早苗涉台谬论，公然干涉中国内政，表达企图武装介入台湾问题的野心，对中国发出武力威胁。
Okay, so Michael, what do you make of the characterization that's in this report?
Well, I think the one line that Japan takes issue with is the suggestion that that it represents a strategic shift, right? I actually don't think Japan necessarily reads too much into the language and draws a conclusion that the wording of the U.S. report suggests that it's putting the blame on Japan. Although there's a little bit of it, I think for Taiwan we always are sensitive about it as well. When there's language about Taiwan and China, we always want to make sure that the message is sent correctly, that it's not Taiwan causing something, right? It's China's aggression. And same in this case. But I think what Japan has wanted to clarify the most is the suggestion that this is a strategic shift in its policy. In their view, it's not. It may have been enunciated more clearly this time by Prime Minister Takaichi in her Q&A session in Parliament, but it does not, in Japan's view, represent a big shift.
Okay. Patrick, I want to get your view. Tokyo says that the report is inaccurate because it's not a significant shift. Why is this so important in terms of a U.S. intelligence report which is used to advise the government on the biggest threats facing the U.S. over the next year?
Well, this came out of the same director of national intelligence who said it's not her job to determine what's an imminent threat. So it suggests that the intelligence community is being politicized. So you have to parse that paragraph carefully. The one sentence that says Japan's was a significant shift, that's a political statement. It sounds like a sop to try to ease the way when President Trump eventually goes to China to meet with Xi Jinping, because it does take the Chinese view. It's not accurate. Any intelligence analyst who follows Japan would say, no, there's no significant shift. Right. Maybe there should be, but there's not. The other line in that paragraph, though, was that China perceives it as a threat. Now, that's accurate. China has, both perceives it and uses it because they're trying to constrain Japan's choices, because China has two red lines that they want to teach the world on Taiwan, right? Which is no independence, no interference. And they see that as bordering on interference, what Japan was saying. So they're trying to push back on that and constrain the options of any other country to support Taiwan. That's not, that's predictable. It's what you expect out of China. But the idea that Japan has had any significant shift in its policy is just wrong.
So in terms of that narrative from China that you just outlined, so how dangerous is it that this U.S. report should word it in that way?
Well, just throw it in the basket of we're very ambiguous about so many things when it comes to Taiwan. And it's living recklessly and carelessly. We'd like more precision in the world. We'd like to have much more straightforward. But this is where we live with Taiwan. I think somebody said that Taiwan is a bit like Harry Potter. It's where's that train platform exactly that you get on to figure out how do you characterize Taiwan in this issue. So I wouldn't get too exercised over this statement. I see no change really from Japan. I see China fulminating the way they like to fulminate because they're trying to put up barriers to anybody interfering, quote unquote, with their what they think is their rogue province. So it's more or less the same we've seen in the past. I don't think this is particularly a new danger, but it is a dangerous situation. This is a serious situation. It needs to be treated seriously. And that's why Taiwan is preparing its defenses, and that's why Japan wants to support, and why the United States and Japan, in their joint statement, put out all the right language on why Taiwan Strait is such a critical issue in international security.
Okay, Michael, final question. So the trip originally, as we said in the opening, was meant to, boost the U.S. alliance, U.S.-Japan alliance in the face of these increasing threats from China. How well do you think, away maybe from the cameras, did Takaichi, or has Takaichi so far managed to sort of refocus Donald Trump's attention on the Indo-Pacific and China?
Well, I think it's still a bit hard to tell because we're only still seeing just the public side of what happened, what emerged with the Trump-Takaichi meeting. I think we'll hear more about what happened in between them in the coming days. But I think, look, the situation has shifted so fast, right, as you mentioned. And so kind of the strategic objectives needed to be adjusted as well. I guess perhaps lowered your initial goals. Our goals originally talking about China and the importance of Indo-Pacific, the alliance to Trump, and ensuring that part is strong and stronger. And now it's just dealing with Iran and making sure Japan can respond to Trump's requests correctly. And as a secondary goal, yes, making sure the U.S. alliance stays strong, and maybe if there's an opportunity, talk about the threats posed by China. But of course, like the Trump-Xi meeting has been postponed.
And how much Japan and Takaichi put into the first, which is the response to the Iran war, will then also impact on the second.
Of course, right? I mean, if she fumbles the first, then there's no hope talking to Trump about the second goal, right? The importance of the alliance. But I think, as Dr. Krohn has said, I think overall, given the circumstances and challenging terrain and set of issues, this has been a fairly successful trip. In terms of a lot of the business investment announcements have been made, in terms of kind of the energy, the rare earth cooperation that's been announced, and other issues that they're working on. And I think she handled the Iran question fairly well. So I think overall this trips can still be categorized as a success.
Okay. Patrick, do you want to offer any final thoughts?
No, I agree. I think it's a successful summit so far. And I, just watching the footage of the president laughing in a good way, smiling at the prime minister's references, that shows you a lot. I mean, this is a president who's beleaguered right now on the war front and on the economy. And here he's having a very successful time with the Japanese prime minister once again.
Okay, we will end on that positive note. Thank you so much for joining us, Patrick, from Washington, D.C. tonight. And also,
my pleasure.
And also Michael Chen in the studio. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, if you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. See you next time.